It's a real treat for me to have been invited to come here and be with you in Little Rock today. It's always better to be invited than to be dispatched, which is the way that I usually wound up in Little Rock over the years. You see, as Skip explained, I spent much of the second term of the Clinton administration as the Southern Bureau Chief for the New York Times, and my territory included Arkansas. Our editor at the time had what I would say is an unhealthy obsession with man-in-the-street stories. We called them voices pieces, but they really were the same concept. You went to some relevant place and sampled random opinion about the news of the day, trying to avoid barbershops whenever possible, and prayed that by deadline you'd be able to find some common threads that you could weave into a story. Well, you all know what the news of the day back then was. The news of the day, the news of every day, was Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, and Ken Starr. The details escape me at the moment, but I'm sure some of you may remember it. And so it became my portfolio to travel to Little Rock on an embarrassingly regular basis, to document how Bill Clinton's homies were coping, and to take the city's temperature, to gauge whether all those friends of Bill still were friends of Bill, and of course, to expose their suffering and their shame for all to see. Now, often I found this research was best conducted over a cold beer or three at Doe's Eat Place. You can look it up, though I'd prefer that you didn't. 1998, the night of the State of the Union address, at the height of the scandal, a moment of great constitutional tension for the democracy. The headline on my story, "State of the Tamales is the message." I'm quite sure I've never been prouder. And then there was this succession of headlines. January 27th, 1998, a deep weariness in Little Rock. 6 weeks later, March 8th, 1998, Little Rock growing weary of the 4-year siege by Starr. I'm sure at that point that the most wearying thing to the city of Little Rock were my stories about the city's weariness. But there would still be others. As Clinton Library is planned, tough questions abound. And then pardon is trouble for Clinton Library, obviously very prescient. On many of those trips to Little Rock, I found myself sitting at the table of the city's unelected mayor, James L. Rutherford, known to all as Skip, except to his wife, Billy, who I'm sure you all know prefers to call him Skipper. Oh, you didn't all know that? Well, now you know that. But I can't let the moment pass without acknowledging that Dean Rutherford was for me, as I'm sure for many other reporters, a very good source of information. If you needed to know about the city, about the president and his circle, about the Little Rock Nine, about the Clinton Library, or more importantly about Central High's basketball prospects for the coming year, all you need to do was look up Skip. But Skip wasn't just good company. He was and is what we in the South like to call good people. And I'm sure all of you appreciate his devotion to this community, and I'm certain that this impressive new institution will benefit from his leadership for many years. So, after an absence of a couple of years, it's great to be back here, to see the building next door that I last saw as an architect's model, and to reminisce a bit about the good old days when I used to be a newspaper reporter. I say used to be because those of us who do this for a living, for better or worse, are very much an endangered species right now. When people ask me what I do, I still reflexively respond that I'm a newspaper reporter. But the truth is that that description is now a quaint affectation that no longer remotely describes the craft. It's sort of like calling a truck driver a teamster. Let's face it, what I am these days is a content provider. I blame this on all of you. You, of course, meaning the Time Magazine Person of the Year sense of the word you. You and your Craigslist, and your MySpace, and your Facebook, and your YouTube. You and your Blackberries, and your podcasts, and all your blogs, whatever the hell they actually are. I can remember congratulating myself a while back on the timing of my birth, projecting that my generation of newspaper reporters would surely be the last to escape the tumultuous transition from print to electronic journalism. All right, so I was only off by a couple of decades. But before circling back to this point, let me tell you just a little bit about how I've spent the last 26 years. I always figured it was the normalcy of my childhood in Jacksonville, Florida, that made the rest of the world seem so damn interesting, and that drew me so passionately to telling the stories of others. Journalism, for me, was a way to experience a world that was otherwise beyond my reach and imagination, and in the process to make that world a smaller and more accessible place. Over the years, the breadth of my curiosity steered me towards the life of a generalist. It's something of a point of pride for me that I've practiced virtually every journalistic form, from investigations to breaking news, from sense of place features to serial narratives. I've covered county government, state government, major crime, higher education, race relations, and gay marriage, 4 presidential campaigns, and I'm proud to say the world's only dry Oktoberfest in Cullman, Alabama. It's a dry county. I've been fortunate to see some cool stuff, the moments that make a journalist realize that he's witnessing history. I was in Nashville the night that Al Gore conceded the 2000 presidential campaign and then unconceded it. I was there the night the bomb went off at Centennial Olympic Park during the 1996 games in Atlanta. I heard a Birmingham jury convict a Klansman in a church bombing that killed 4 little girls a remarkable 38 years earlier. I've sat across a table from George W. Bush one-on-one. I've driven into more hurricanes than I care to remember. In the latter stages of my career, I've been fortunate to write long examinations of some very compelling topics about the racial life of an integrated church, about the suspect safety record of the Marine Corps' Air Fleet, about the concealed deaths of detainees in Afghanistan, even about the attempts of a gay couple to produce a child through assisted reproduction. Those stories, those moments, become an indelible part of a journalist's being, the stories of others gradually morphing into our own. To some extent, we newspaper reporters really are what we write. Just ask anyone who's had the misfortune of being cornered by one of us at a cocktail party. Why do we do it? Well, because it should be obvious from my story list, more days than not, it's a really fun and interesting way to make a living. You learn something new about the world every day, or talk to someone smarter than you just about every day. But we also do it without trying to sound too high and mighty, because somebody has to bear witness. Somebody must inform the rest of us about the operations and affairs of our ever-complicated world. Somebody must gather the facts needed to put our lives into context. Somebody must hold accountable those with the power and speak for those without. Nothing I've experienced in my 26 years as a newspaper reporter has diminished my conviction that the free flow of information has a democratizing and progressive impact on just about every component of society. Do newspaper stories matter? Well, think about how our understanding of the world would have been different without them, if only this decade. Without the New York Times' coverage of 9/11, without the reporting about the war and Abu Ghraib and Haditha and torture and wiretapping and Enron, without the Washington Post's exposés about Jack Abramoff and the CIA's secret prisons and the conditions at Walter Reed, without the coverage of Katrina and its aftermath, without the San Francisco Chronicle's coverage of the baseball steroid scandal. And yet, because fewer and fewer Americans read for their news, and because those who do see no reason to pay for content they can get for free, U.S. daily newspaper circulation dropped from 62 million in 1990 to 53 million in 2005. That's basically a percentage point a year. New figures out only yesterday show that almost all newspapers continue to hemorrhage, with circulation down at 21 of the 25 largest newspapers in the country over the last 6 months, and down by at least 7% at the dailies in Atlanta, Denver, Miami, Dallas, San Diego, and Fort Lauderdale. At the New York Times, we were down 4.5% on weekdays, almost 8% on Sundays. The most distressing part is that there seems to be absolutely no correlation between newspaper quality and newspaper circulation. Since 2000, the LA Times, my former newspaper, has won 14 Pulitzer Prizes. And while prizes are not the end-all and be-all and end-all of journalistic quality, I can assure you that that paper has been very good day in and day out for a number of years. They've had an amazing run, and yet over the same period, the paper's Monday to Saturday circulation declined by an astonishing 27%. Sunday circulation dropped by 15%. Of course, declining circulation is only part of newspapering's problem. The rest has to do with the flight of advertising to the web, the slowness of mainstream news organizations to adapt to new technologies, the corporatization of newsrooms, and the relentless pressure by shareholders for profits that bear no relationship to the public service obligations of a free press. One newspaper analyst recently calculated, with the steady decline in newspaper shares, that $13.5 billion in newspaper capital value has vaporized over the last 2 years. As a New York Times shareholder, I can assure you that those prices have continued to drop since that study was done. The result, these days, we can literally see American newspapers shrinking before our eyes. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have recently shaved the width of their newspapers to save money. Many papers, including my own, are selling ads on their once sacrosanct section fronts, displacing the news. Editor and Publisher magazine conservatively estimates that 2,100 newspaper jobs were lost in 2005 and another 1,000 in 2006. Here's the body count from just the past week. 14 jobs at the Sarasota Herald Tribune, 15 at the Spokane Spokesman Review, 40 at the Houston Chronicle. At the LA Times, the newsroom had about 1,200 employees when I joined in 2002. It was down to about 850 when I left last spring. If you think those types of reductions don't affect the quantity and quality of the news we report, think again. At a moment when world events have more bearing than at perhaps any time in U.S. history, the number of foreign correspondents for U.S. newspapers dropped by 25% in 4 years, from 188 in 2002 to 141 in 2006. Papers in the Tribune chain shuttered bureaus in Johannesburg, Moscow, London, Beijing, Beirut, and Islamabad. Not that there's much news going on in any of those places. The Boston Globe announced earlier this year that it was closing its last 3 foreign bureaus in Jerusalem, Berlin, and Bogota. Many papers, according to a recent story in the New York Times, are significantly trimming their Washington staffs. Tribune papers have cut 30% of their staff in D.C. The Dallas Morning News went from 10 to 4, the Globe from 12 to 10. If forced to predict, I would guess that investigative reporting will be next to feel the squeeze, as it is hugely expensive and speculative work. To survive, newspapers are becoming increasingly localized. Robust local coverage is a good thing, but I fear that we're fast approaching the day when only a very small band of news organizations, perhaps only 3 or 4, will have the resources and ambition to comprehensively cover our country and our world. It begs the question, does anyone really think we need fewer eyes on our federal government right now, or on foreign affairs? I recognize that I run the risk here of sounding like the ghost of journalism past, and I've certainly got the gray hair to play the part. But if you'll hear me out, I hope you'll see that I'm not simply pining for the good old days. I'm not boo-hooing about the loss of my mainstream media privilege to those unrefined, party-crashing bloggers. And I'm certainly not arguing that newspaper reporters are more entitled than, say, textile workers to protection from technological change. Like most journalists, I recognize that we live in a Darwinian world and that you either evolve or perish. In our business, the change is here and nothing will reverse it. Furthermore, I recognize that there are bigger threats to humankind than the loss of a few thousand newspaper jobs. Nuclear terrorism comes to mind, catastrophic climate change. But will we know as much? Will we know enough about those challenges and the hundreds of others without a rigorous press that has the resources to dig for real truth and insight. And without all the information we can get, will we really have a fighting chance? And therein lies the rub. At least for the moment, the new media has shown little interest in assuming the old media's mission of fully and fairly reporting the news. As newspapers shrink their staffs and news-gathering resources, pitifully few web-based organizations are picking up the responsibility. There are some very gradual signs of progress, particularly at the hyper-local level, where websites are starting to shine a light on their local governments with the help of citizen reporters and public records aggregations. But when it comes to national, international, and investigative journalism, the big internet players seem cynically satisfied to replace and repackage the content produced by us old media types. If Google and Yahoo and YouTube have any reporters risking their asses in Baghdad, I'm not aware of it. And I didn't notice any of them documenting conditions in the Superdome either. The great irony of all this, it seems to me, is that in an age when we are so hungry for information, we seem to have little appetite for fact, for truth, for context, and balance. Someone needs to recognize that there's still a market for those values. I recognize that the internet, at its best, is also a democratizing force that gives everyone a real voice. But blogs, from my observation, are mostly what people think, not what they know. I was in our building in New York a couple of weeks ago and struck up a conversation with a young guy we've hired recently to write a reported blog about the TV industry. And when I asked him how it was going so far, he told me it was a bit of an adjustment because, after all, he'd never had to do actual reporting before. Well, I can faithfully report to you, as evidenced by our hiring of a small army of bloggers on subjects from healthcare to City Hall, the New York Times is marching aggressively into this future. Our website is the most visited newspaper site in the country, and for good reason. It's loaded with value added: video, audio, links to documents, transcripts, graphics, photos, blogs, you name it. Our monthly nytimes.com audience is now 14 million, twice our 6.4 million print readership. Unfortunately, our nytimes.com advertising revenues are not twice our print revenues, or we wouldn't be in this fix. As journalists, we're encouraged every day at the Times to look for ways to use the web to tell our stories. Last week, I reported a piece in rural Alabama with a Times photographer who came equipped with audio equipment for the slideshow he'd been asked to produce for our website. When I reported a few weeks ago on the story that Skip mentioned, this government study that documented thousands of deaths from drug-resistant staph bacterial infections, I filed a piece to our website just as soon as the 4 p.m. embargo on the study was lifted, rather than waiting to file for the morning paper. And it's a damn good thing I did, because both the Washington Post and the AP did the same thing. So we're all drinking the Kool-Aid, but here's the thing. All of the technological bells and whistles and blogs simply do not eliminate the need for fact-finding. And they certainly don't obviate the need for a professional press that, believe it or not, operates most of the time according to very stringent standards of accuracy and fairness. I pray that in this transitional period, when newspapers can barely afford to report the news and websites have yet to see the profit in doing so, that we don't completely discard the values that distinguishes the best journalism. I'm generalizing here, but the blogs, and to some extent even newspaper websites, are all about speed and sensation, neither of which have much respect for accuracy and context. And without trying to sound too old media, the interactivity of today's technology, while positive in many ways, may give you, the reader, just a little too much say over what we publish. We know what you like, because we know what you read. We can measure the hits every single second. And if we'll drive their ad rates up, many papers will be tempted, I'm sure, to give you all the Britney and Brangelina you can handle, and perhaps pull a reporter out of Islamabad or New Orleans to do it. Will the news organizations of the future encourage reporters to dig deep and think big, the way the LA Times did in allowing me and my colleague Alan Miller to investigate the Harrier jump jet, or the way the New York Times allowed me to spend a year in an integrated Pentecostal church? I wish I could be optimistic. John Carroll, one of the two editors-in-chief who left the LA Times recently rather than preside over deep budget cuts, made an informed estimate that at least 80% of America's news originates with newspapers. In a newspaper-free future, he asked in a recent speech, who will make the checks at City Hall? Who will go down to the courthouse every day or to the police station? Who will inspect the tens of thousands of politicians who seek to govern? Who, amid America's great din of flackery and cant, will tell us in plain language what is actually going on? If newspapers fade away, John said, and no one else steps forward to do the grunt work of turning over rocks, what will the American public know in the future? What stories will go untold? What issues will go unraised? I've been wondering the same thing. What worries me is not that newspaper reporters may have to adapt to survive. What really worries me is that the death of newspapers is also seriously threatening the health of journalism, and at a time when we can ill afford to understand less about our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. I want to begin my remarks today by telling you a wonderful story that happened to me last week when I went to purchase a new pair of shoes for Little Rock. And I'm going to tell you this story, and I hope Patrick will take a voice vote on what the audience decision is when we're finished. I went into a shoe store, and the person who was helping me select shoes was clearly not interested in my shoe selection or really, apparently, his job. And so I meandered around the store and finally chose the shoes which now reside on my feet. And he said, "Are these shoes for a special occasion?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, they are. I'm going to Arkansas, and I'm going to be giving a talk in Little Rock." And that's all I said. And so time goes by, and I've got one shoe on and one shoe off, and he looks up at me. I've never met him, and he said, and I quote, "If you're going to Little Rock to talk about that book, you can go barefoot." I picked up that book in Barnes & Noble and couldn't put it down. The world was ready for your book. So immediately I wanted to buy 10 shoes, none matching, and give him credit for this tremendous sale. So what I'd like to know when I'm finished talking with you today, and I'm very glad to be here, is whether or not indeed I could have come barefoot to Little Rock. That's what I would like to know. So, good afternoon to everyone. Two different stories of my college students' involvement in service learning at Piedmont Virginia Community College are just ripe for telling at the Clinton School of Public Service. One of my favorite tales is of young Robert, a struggling student suffering in my Introduction to Philosophy course, who excitedly chose to engage in service learning by tutoring children at his former elementary school. While he was full of anecdotes concerning all that was happening in his work with third graders, his struggles with college philosophy spiraled downward, from his initial hearty disinterest to ignoring the assignments, and finally in Robert not attending class at all. I never saw Robert again. After a few weeks, I sat down to make the dreaded call to the school's principal to apologize for Robert's failure to complete the term with the children as promised. Easing into the conversation, I began by saying that I was calling to talk about my student, Robert, when the principal interrupted and exclaimed, "He is the best thing that has happened to our school this year. He stopped coming once a week and now comes every day." Another story is at the heart of the Clinton School of Public Service. Upon actually completing her Introduction to Philosophy course, Kristen transferred to Virginia Commonwealth University, and as an AmeriCorps member, designed a program using Little Big Minds to work with children in the toughest of neighborhoods in Richmond, Virginia. Against long odds, through philosophical discussion coupled with art activities, the children found the confidence to have a go at meditation, began to appreciate the rewards of mindfulness, and chose to plant a garden on a small plot of land at their school. With time and encouragement, the new child philosophers were proud of their discoveries gleaned from quiet introspection. These private truths belonged to them alone. In their philosophy journals, the children wrote about happiness and courage, and in their art and poetry, these concepts came alive. Kristen gave these children tools for life, the pleasures and benefits of clear thinking, quiet reflection, and good conversation. In Little Big Minds, I look at philosophers around the globe, ancient and modern, female and male, and use cross-cultural literature, music, and poetry for further investigation of philosophical ideas. Possibilities for art and service activities abound. Teaching tips appear the moment the reader might wonder, what if? And a seemingly infinite number of discussion questions are there for the asking. Stories from my experience with the child philosophers invite the reader to get started. Each chapter examines one philosophical concept, followed by a look at two topics that encourage in-depth conversation. The topics and concepts are the ones that have been of most interest to my child philosophers in over 15 years with them, the ones they could best use to improve their lives. Briefly, the chapters are: philosophy with Socrates and Plato, learning with them about the examined life and good conversation; friendship with bell hooks and Karl Jaspers, looking at listening and bullying; responsibility with Rita Manning and Albert Camus, turning responsibility from a burden into a unique opportunity; happiness with Epicurus and Charlotte Joko Beck, welcoming simplicity and discovering ways to create balance; justice with Immanuel Kant and Paulo Freire, celebrating dignity and children's rights; time with Augustine and Alan Watts, dancing with the children as they ride the roller coaster of change, yet also find permanence; courage with Epictetus and Mary Wollstonecraft, nudging the children towards facing their fears and finding their voices; death with Shunryu Suzuki and the Hindu classic The Bhagavad Gita, moving towards making peace with death as part of nature's way; prejudice with Jean-Paul Sartre and Gloria Anzaldúa, taking a hard look at the vicious cycle prejudice creates and how to heal the wounds it inflicts; God with Thomas Aquinas and Al-Ghazali, enjoying stretching the mind as it seeks to grasp perfection while embracing mystery; humanity with Soren Kierkegaard and Elizabeth Spellman, disbanding cliques and creating a sense of personal identity; nature with Lao Tzu and Baruch Spinoza, gazing with awe at the patterns swirling in nature's beauty; compassion with the Dalai Lama and Jane Addams, opening the door to gratitude and service; freedom with John Stuart Mill and Simone de Beauvoir, taking pleasure in spontaneity and anticipating the future; love with Martin Luther King Jr. and Bertrand Russell, appreciating the move from big minds to big hearts and using philosophy to grow towards peace. The warm national and international reception for my book fills me with hope. Adults and children are welcoming together a return to an invigorated mental and soulful life. To give you a peek inside Little Big Minds, here's a sample exercise from the chapter on justice in the section on children's rights, perfect for this day and this place. Recite slowly and with feeling Maya Angelou's 1993 inaugural poem, we know whose inauguration, On the Pulse of Morning. Young ears perk up and eyes brighten when they hear her invite children to a new day in her poem. All the many individuals who make up this one country must join together, she pleads, and look into one another's eyes. Help the children take the poem apart and define and explain for them as needed. Angelo looks at some groups that have suffered injustice in our nation's past, such as the African and Native American. As you look with the child philosophers at the wide variety of cultures represented in this poem, ask the children how the United States can become everyone's country, your country, as Angelo hopes. What steps can the child philosophers suggest to combat oppression of any group? Invite them to create an original poem based on Angelo's words, quote, "I am the tree planted by the river, which will not be moved." In their poem, have them describe the principles of justice they would want to plant like a tree that grows by the river forever. Since the book's release at the first of the year, it has been a softly dramatic experience for me to reflect upon it from a distance, keeping in mind responses and reactions sent by readers, as well as questions and comments in bookstores and radio and television interviews. Strangely, I began to learn about my book from others. Briefly, I considered buying it. Piece by piece, I gained new clarity about old questions. The pieces pull together in thinking about my talk with you today. I think that it's a jolt and a gift anytime we come to a significant understanding that we've somehow known all along. Here's how Little Big Minds led me to my recent realization. For years in my college ethics classes, I've talked with students about the unbelievable, unacceptable reality that children are barely mentioned in our text of some 600 pages. How can that be? While I use the phrase child philosopher and Little Big Minds, there are other phrases that should be calling all of us, certainly ethicists, to immediate action. Child soldier, child prostitute, child laborer, child refugee. Academic philosophy, for the most part, does not tackle children's issues, though conferences focus on the moral issues surrounding artificial intelligence with head-spinning linguistic analysis. The world watches as so much of our public debate and governmental policy in this country skirts and shirks the welfare of children. Nelson Mandela reminds us, there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. In the past, I have suggested to my college students a likely reason for this neglect of children's issues in our text and much of academic philosophy. If we really look at the full-blown humanity of every child, coupled with his or her dependency on all of us, this reflection will require radical changes in the way every one of us lives. So what was my unfolding realization coming to me from my book and its readers? A powerful connection appeared, stunning in its simplicity. Every issue looked at in the ethics text is also a children's issue. There are innumerable paths to walk to work for the well-being of children and at the same time work for the well-being of all. That's it. In your public service here, as well as that of individual citizens and organizations worldwide, when you address any social problem with a clear mind, you at the same time advance the cause of the child. Fortunately, when we look honestly at the reality of one hungry child, we look at hunger wherever it hurts. When we look at one neglected child, we look into any place that neglect is hiding. No issue is divorced from children. Every issue has children intimately at its heart. There is but one world. Who knew? Aim at one pin, knock them all down. We need not feel helpless in the face of seemingly insurmountable social problems. there is a positive way of addressing the omission of children in much public and philosophical debate. We can write different books and perhaps put a child on the cover. This discovery is tremendously exciting from a philosopher's perspective. In approximately the 6th century before the Christian era, ancient philosophers worldwide longed for an understanding of life's unity, groped for a glimpse of oneness, sought awareness of unity within the myriad forms of life. Such philosophers as Lao Tzu in China and Thales in Greece asked, what is the one source of life? What is this root that gives rise to such a variety of physical forms, yet does not change while everything else does? What is that elusive common denominator that holds the planet together and keeps it one planet? This simplicity of focus of a unifying factor remains seductive, especially for practical philosophers. Here are just a few of the endless connections between children's issues and everything else. The members of the Pacific Seabird Group labor tirelessly for a tiny, potato-sized seabird, the marble murrelet. How is this bird's life connected to children? Both this bird and children are threatened by mercury poisoning. When murrelets eat fish contaminated by mercury, their reproductive systems are damaged. The ecosystem in which they play a part shifts in unknown ways because we never do one thing in isolation, separate from the whole. Be careful, the murrelet whirs. When children are exposed to mercury, it takes a devastating toll on their kidneys and neurological systems. Take care of the murrelet, take care of the children. Can concentration on any one issue address maternal health, poverty, and HIV while still addressing children? The spread of malaria supports the killing cycle of poverty. Malaria attacks the poor, and debilitating anemia affects every moment of a mother and child who survive it. Malaria and HIV worsen each other, especially in pregnant women, and malaria increases the chance of transmission of HIV to the child. The Nothing But Nets program sends long-lasting insecticide-treated nets to Africa. Just one net covers children and their mothers while fending off poverty and HIV. Preventing malaria protects the lives of mother and child. What is the connection between the work of those who are advocates for the elderly and the disabled and those who work for children? Working on behalf of the disabled and elderly champions the dignity of human beings regardless of age or intellectual ability. What matters is shared humanity rather than one's economic standing in a consumer society. The humanity in senior centers, Special Olympics activities, and Head Start programs is real. We take care of the great-grandmother, of the autistic uncle, and the child to honor the dignity of humanity itself. Is there a reason for collaboration between social services and animal protection? A way of living that rests on a desire for dominance and control repeats itself in cruelty directed at both children and animals. Violence inflicted on animals and children is sneaky and hidden, happening to those who can't protect themselves. Humane societies and child protective services could share an office. Sadly, veterinarians and pediatricians are looking for the same signs of abuse while finding it most often in the same home. Taking all forms of violence seriously helps us hear the cry of the child and the cat together. Yet another example of common cause. For many children in this country, books and programs in their libraries and organized activities on their playgrounds provide their first reliable exposure to the world of ideas and the delight of recreation. Imagining a big world through reading and playing chess and soccer presents children with possibilities. Laughter and inspiration at an early age can put a good future within reach. Despair and isolation so often leave a life of crime as the most available option. Years ago, I hiked with some of my college students and children from city playgrounds to a place with a view. From their vantage point, the children could see the regional jail as well as the community college. They began to name friends and relatives in both places offhandedly and naturally. And then this ringing remark, "I wonder which place I'll wind up in." A child asked this, shrugging his shoulders. We came back from the hike and quickly began an art project. Taking care of children's education and recreation takes care of crime in the most positive way. What part can philosophy play in reshaping our world? I define philosophy as the art of clear thinking. Ideas guide our actions. Whether clear or fuzzy, ideas mold our lives. The philosopher is willing to unlearn stale ideas and to let go of tried and untrue assumptions. It is an art to listen attentively to others and the world itself. Far from being abstract and removed from life, philosophy is the most practical tool imaginable. Genuine communication can occur only between unlocked minds. Though we come together with different beliefs and from different places on this planet, we still stand on common ground. In healthy communities, vigorous discussion of ideas was and is a part of everyday life. On the day he died, sentenced by an Athenian jury for corrupting the youth through his relentless questioning of everyone and everything, Socrates passionately encouraged his followers to keep faith in the power of well-intentioned dialogue. Practicing the art of clear thinking is the key to good living for Plato and Socrates. These toga-clad philosophers are adamant that it is our confusion about ideas that is the source of all our difficulties. Lack of clarity about the meaning of love leaves hate as its residue. A blurred view of responsibility presents itself as environmental degradation and isolation from our neighbors. One quiet 8-year-old boy states in Little Big Minds, "The reason for war is that everybody has forgotten what peace means." In Plato's timeless myth of the cave, he asks that we imagine prisoners bound by the neck and ankles from birth, living in a dark cave. Up a steep incline, there is a glimmer of light at the mouth of the cave. A bit of light from a fire casts reflections on a cave wall. Unable to turn, knowing nothing else and with no reason to doubt, the prisoners accept the shadows as reality. The cave is all the prisoners know. Eventually, one of them shakes loose, spurred by curiosity, and begins the arduous journey towards the light, a painful journey for a stiff, newly mobile body. Up, up, up until at last, bright sunlight. A new world appears. The dazzling sun shines on the world of ideas. Ah, courage, friendship, peace. Happiness is real, the former prisoner claps his hands, and as he continues to gaze, he can see its meaning more and more clearly. Freedom, compassion, truth. What is Plato telling us through this myth from ancient Greece. Trapped and bound by convention, unquestioning and bound by habit, we are the prisoners in the cave. While some of us may choose to remain cave-bound, the escaped prisoner points to the sunlight. If you feed your souls, your lives will be filled. Don't waste your minds and hearts. The escapee, Plato's mentor Socrates, is not spouting empty platitudes. He admits that exercising the mind to its potential is daunting work. It's the work of a lifetime, and you never quite gain perfect understanding. But it's the process, the struggle, the small and larger visions of true meaning that matter. Philosophy, that art of clear thinking, is a wake-up call to action. Two issues are prime examples of a dearth of reflection and insightful dialogue. The first issue, begging for a house call from a philosopher, is the question of the meaning of education. I've asked children in countless classrooms why they are in school. Almost without exception, they are stumped and intrigued by such a seemingly absurd question. I pursue the question further. Why do you carry those heavy backpacks 5 days a week and spend 6 hours a day at your desk? More silence follows, and I let the silence hover. Fog gathers. If a student raises a hand to answer, most often I hear, "I'm in school to get a job." The children laugh good-naturedly when I say with amazement, "That's remarkable. You're looking for a job. You're only in the 2nd grade." My lighthearted telling to you of these repeated exchanges points to a critical problem. Where are those school buses going? Why? What happens there? What is the meaning of education? Why aren't we talking about it with children? Shouldn't an understanding of education ground, guide, and motivate students of any age? The root of the word educate means to lead up and to lead out, to draw out. Does our educational system have the interest of every child at its core? Whether public or private, are we leading children out of the cave in which illusion is confused with reality? I noticed that one of the subjects for recommended reading suggested by the 2007 Clinton School class is Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire's insights about education delight children and are part of the chapter on justice in Little Big Minds. Here's a quote. Freire takes a hard look at the role of accomplice that institutional education can play in perpetuating oppression through a repressive educational practice that he labels the banking method. The banking method deposits the values of the status quo into students who are seen as no more than passive receptacles. No questions asked, no action taken. Freire knows the futility of breaking the cycle of poverty without educational reform. He challenges educational practitioners everywhere to rethink critically both the method and the content of their teaching. True to its meaning, education should lead the student up and out of social injustice by showcasing its causes while teaching students the skills to resist and overcome. For this Brazilian revolutionary, the purpose of education is not to teach students to conform to an oppressive society that holds no hope for those living on the fringe. Systems, structures, standards can be wrong, can be deadly, but we can do better in our country today. If we think back, we have a legacy in the United States of the use of education to correct societal ills in keeping with Freire's spirit. The GI Bills, Title IX, and this city's Little Rock 9. The second issue begging for a visit from philosophy is galloping consumerism. Philosophers throughout time and across cultures join hands and issue a dramatic warning of the threat posed by our desire for things. Devotion to material possessions robs the mind and the heart of the time we owe to our mental and spiritual development. Toys are not us. Is there a store in Little Rock? Confusion and obsession comes to children who have too much. This excess coexists frighteningly with the defeat that comes to children who have so little. Such stark contrast between childhoods stains our society today. Picture the glaring gap between those with and without material possessions with this image. I have walked down many hallways, cluttered with lost and found containers, overflowing with barely worn name brands, on my way to classrooms filled with children whose home is the Salvation Army. Little Big Minds is my effort to bring philosophy back home again, to engage adults in the world of ideas with, I think, the world's most natural philosophers, the children. Little Big Minds honors the child philosophers' humanity and dignity and celebrates their unlimited possibilities. Here is one of my very favorite proofs of the ability of a child philosopher from Little Big Minds, seasoned by 3 years of philosophy in his classroom. Picture the mustard-covered face of 7-year-old Simon, his clothes redesigned by finger paints, as he raises his hand nonchalantly at the end of our discussion of Lao Tzu and Spinoza. Quote, "It's the space that does it." I think in the very beginning there was empty space, but it wasn't chaos. Then tiny things came out of it, like a speck of dust, a speck of mineral, and one drop of water like the point of a pin. Struggling to keep up with him, I asked Simon what made the tiny things come out of empty space if space were really empty. He answered me matter-of-factly, "Question in its purest form. Even now we still question our world, don't we? Question powers everything." I want to tell Simon, yes, we still question our world. How are we living? What is enough? Are we wise? Happy? The Clinton School of Public Service and Little Big Minds are soulmates. For the child philosophers, as well as students and faculty at the Clinton School, philosophical grounding in the meaning of service can play a big part in motivation to act. In every classroom in which I take philosophy to children, I invite the children to use their clearer understanding of a concept to develop a service project. For example, the children are quick to link compassion and service. I define service for the children as the gift of time and energy that comes from their ability to identify with another's life. Through your own ongoing questioning and conversation with each other here about service, I think you will find that a fluid, dynamic, evolving definition of service will sustain your efforts as it does child philosophers. Understanding what it means to serve drives giving. Under philosophy's microscope, responsibility is seen as an opportunity and service as membership dues paid to belong in and to the world. The child on the cover of Little Big Minds is becoming a world traveler. In 2008, the book will be published in Taiwan and Italy. The president of a software company in Beijing wrote eloquently of the damage done by the current obsession with technological development in mainland China and in his company specifically. He bought a copy of Little Big Minds for each of his employees to reawaken priorities. Some schools are using philosophy as the glue that binds their curriculum by integrating it into all disciplines. Schools are assigning homework based on Little Big Minds for adults and children to do together. Daycare workers and drama and art teachers find the lessons of philosophy instrumental in their work. In one day, a lovely combination was a call-in from a grandmother in Indiana about the way she uses the book with her grandson on their front porch, along with an email from Muslim high school students in Trenton, New Jersey, about their use of Little Big Minds to tutor in elementary schools. Philosophy clubs are popping up everywhere. Gratitude and great expectations fill me. This summer, I had the privilege of seeing my book in action in the loving hands of a teacher who, with no training in philosophy, used it to teach 3 two-week courses entitled Discovering and Developing the Philosopher Within. I visited the children in each session, and they were full of questions. Questions such as, what did people say when you told them children were good philosophers? Many didn't believe me. Do you think a good definition of philosophy is upside-down thinking? It's perfect. I wish I thought of it myself. Has your book made you rich? Yes, but not in the way you think. But the best question came from young Noah. It took you a long time to write your book, and you're still spending a lot of time on it. So I think that you have something else in mind. What do you want to happen because of it? My answer for Noah. In a gentle way, I hope our country can change because people are thinking and talking about ideas again. Climbing out of the cave, life will look brighter and not so hard and confusing. Oh, I see, people will say to each other. Noah, when you and your 24 classmates return to your hometowns as philosophers, every life you touch with your new understanding will be part of the change. You've looked honestly at prejudice, for example, and it will be very hard for you to ignore the damage that comes from stereotypes. You've examined dignity and understand its relation to justice. You realize that love can rule out violence. And I think you like the idea that the world is calling your name and looking forward to your response. As I paused to give him time to think and to ask a question if he had one, Noah placed his slipping glasses back on the bridge of his nose, smiling, silent. So I continued, change will come, little by little, person to person, touching everything. I have huge hopes for the future because as I sat here in your classroom, I began to multiply it by other classrooms, by other dinner tables, by other porches and playgrounds. I imagined so many children and grown-ups with big minds and gigantic hearts, I could never count them. Do you think this is too much to hope for? I asked. Pausing, Noah replied, not if we remember. And he continued, just one other thing. His words, this one other thing, in and of itself, are worth my coming to Little Rock in new shoes to share with you. 11-year-old Noah pointed to some of the topics from my book that were written on the board in his classroom. On this day, he looked at friendship, responsibility, happiness, justice, courage, prejudice, nature, and love. Noah's realization is at the very heart of Little Big Minds and the Clinton School of Public Service. His wisdom is direct. Quote, all those words add up to help. Helping others. That's what they have in common. If we help others, it means we understand all those ideas. Just help. To honor young Noah, I've asked myself his question again. What do I want to come from Little Big Minds? My hope is that together we can unlearn the old stuff. Find delight as we slow down and relax and talk with each other. Experience the assurance from the natural world of beauty that we have, as the poet Mary Oliver says, a place in the family of things. With a place in the family of things, we can trust more and fear less, appreciating as if for the first time the full experience of being alive. With tactile sensitivity all around, those who suffer will be answered without asking. It is so simple, I can barely speak it. Something like, pick up the can at your feet so that a child doesn't step on it, while remembering that we are all children of the earth. As philosophers of all ages enter together and engage each other in the world of ideas, I hope that a steady spotlight beams on the ideal of peace. What does peace mean? What is it? Can we unravel its meaning? I think so. I know for sure we can try harder. The concept and the reality of peace are worth not fighting for. With a deepening understanding of peace, anything can happen. The veil lifts. Farewell, cave. Here comes the sun. I like your place. Thank you for having me. Now let's talk together.
I thought I would try to talk to you today about what I think and hope is public service, but in a private sector setting. Specifically, it's about how I came to be doing what I'm doing and how our company, I think, has turned an idea that I got while working as a journalist into something that's not only a good business, but is what I think can be a model for a common sense solution to two of the key frustrations of the post 9/11 era. And those frustrations are the effort to balance security needs with the free flow of commerce, and also the need to balance security needs with our fundamental rights to privacy. It's an idea, I think, that it also helps to engage the enterprise and the ingenuity of the private sector with the talent and the determination and the resources of those in our government who are responsible for protecting the homeland. It's also an idea that's built around what is considered to be cutting-edge technology, but there's a little catch here, which is I don't know anything about the technology. The only thing I know is that it works, and I knew enough to know that this technology, in this case, the ability to link a person's unique biometric identifiers, which is a fancy word for fingerprints or the images that are in your iris, to link a person's biometric identifiers with his or her real identity, link my fingerprint with me, and then encrypt that onto a card, what's called a smart card. I knew that that technology was now there, that it was effective, and most important, that it was relatively inexpensive. That much I knew when I started this company, which is now called Clear. Just the same as I knew in the early 1990s that you could take the magic of another technology, in this case, the ability of a satellite transponder to send a television signal very inexpensively all over the world, just the way I knew then that you could use that technology to transfer another idea I had into a reality, which was that you could bring the drama of the justice system, the drama of what I think is the best justice system in the world, and the inner workings of that system into millions of American living rooms live. Now, Court TV doesn't really do that anymore, but don't blame me because I have nothing to do with it anymore. So, as a result of the book that I had written that you heard mentioned about America's response to the 9/11 attacks, I knew that this biometric technology could bring about what I thought would be a dramatic new revolution in how we can balance security and freedom in the post-9/11 world that we all live in. And the book was indeed called After, and it came out in the middle of 2003. It was the story of really all the challenges that America faced and mostly met in the months right after the attacks. For example, how Congress responded well by passing, albeit in a rush and in a process that wasn't pretty, a Victims' Compensation Act that was much maligned, but actually resulted in the victims of the attacks being taken care of at the same time that the airlines were saved from bankruptcy, and I should add, the nation's trial lawyers were deprived of a new gravy train. It was also, for example, about how customs workers and Border Patrol agents rose to the occasion and met their challenges. And it was about how we stood up the largest new federal agency in the history of the country, the Transportation Security Administration, the people who now screen you when you show up at an airport. Well, in doing this book, I was bitten by a bug that just seems to have lodged in my system since the days when I was in law school at Yale Law School. And if you read any of the Clinton biographies carefully, one of the things you know is that Yale Law School is not very difficult. It's difficult to get in, but it's easy to stay. I was standing outside the placement office at the law school, which is where all the vending machines were, and I got this idea when I saw all these law firms who had posted recruiting notices. I got this idea to start a magazine about lawyers instead of becoming one, and that magazine became the American Lawyer magazine, and later expanded into a chain of local and regional legal publications around the country, and then expanded to Court TV. Now, as I was doing the work on this book after, I got another idea that I just couldn't resist, and it just kept sort of hitting me over the head, this idea. And one way it kept hitting me over the head was, as I did my reporting for the book, I'd go to various office buildings, the Justice Department to interview Attorney General Ashcroft, the Customs Agency, an investment bank, the Red Cross, and wherever I went, the same thing would happen. In the lobby of these buildings, they'd ask to see in some kind of ID. They didn't really much care what it was. They certainly didn't check to see if it was real or not, but they'd ask to see some kind of ID. Then they'd say, "Who are you here to see?" And I'd say, "Well, I have an appointment with Attorney General Ashcroft." And they'd call up to his office, and they didn't know who necessarily they were talking to up there, and they'd say, "Fine, send him up." And I remember actually being in the lobby of the Department of Justice, standing behind an FBI agent with his badge out, someone delivering sandwiches from the deli, and me. And we were all treated exactly the same. The FBI agent, he had to have an appointment too. And that just made no sense to me. So I kept thinking, well, why can't there be some kind of identification that you could use that would be recognized and would be secure, and you wouldn't have to stand on lawns like this all the time? So that was one way the idea came to me. The second was that as I was doing my reporting, as I mentioned, I was watching the Transportation Security Administration get stood up. And I think actually in the first year, they did a miraculous job organizing all the people and getting them out into the airports. I actually believe that. I know most of us don't like TSA today, but I really think they did a good job, at least at the beginning. But what were they doing? They were spending 60,000 people and $6 billion organizing 1,750 security checkpoints. And those checkpoints happened to be airports because that's where the terrorists had come. And I remember thinking that, instead of treating everyone exactly the same at airport checkpoints, and indeed instead of trying to create dozens and even hundreds of these $6 billion systems, like the one at the airport, for other security vulnerabilities such as subway stations, office buildings, we really ought to try to think if there isn't something else we can do. Again, why couldn't we have one secure, verifiable card for all of these checkpoints and begin using it to set up a fast line at the airports? And again, I knew enough about the technology to know that you could do that piece of it. The technology you could do. So first, this idea took the form of an article in Newsweek magazine where I was writing a monthly column about Homeland Security issues while I was working on the book. And the article came out in December of 2002. And it said, among other things, quote, "It's inevitable that the terrorists here are going to mimic the suicide bombers who have haunted Israel. And the morning after someone blows up a backpack or himself in a shopping mall, a train, a theater, or the lobby of an office building, we're all going to be standing on the sidewalks for hours waiting to get into all of those places while new low-wage guards, hired in a panic by owners of those venues, man thousands of new checkpoints trying to search us. Commerce and the basic daily movement of people will grind to an infuriating halt. Access control can't be done," I added, "with the kinds of expensive federal screeners and equipment that we've deployed at a cost of $6 billion at the nation's airports because there are hundreds of thousands of such checkpoints elsewhere. We can't afford it, and it would take so long at each checkpoint that the routine flow of people and commerce would be strangled. Instead," I suggested, "we need an efficient way to pre-screen people arriving at those thousands of access points, which means some kind of secure, reliable identification card at least has to be debated." So, I concluded, one possibility is not a national ID card, but one possibility, which I find so logical, that after studying the security and legal issues involved in the past year, I'm tempted to try launching it myself, would be a system based on some kind of credible but voluntary national accepted identification card. The card need not be a government program. It could be issued by private companies licensed by the federal government, which would strictly regulate the card's standards and use. Well, luckily, nobody reads Newsweek, or at least no one was reading my column, because by the time I'd finished the book, no one had done this, and I was still so taken with the idea that I began talking to all kinds of people about it. Lawyers, security experts, aviation people, plain old potential customers, and always I got the same reaction, was that, yeah, it's a really good idea, and if someone could only get it going, it would work. So I plunged in. I put some of my own money up and then got others to invest, including Lockheed Martin, General Electric, Lehman Brothers, and soon the team we had assembled came up with this great name, Clear. The idea was that you'd go online at flyclear.com and sign up to pay $100 for a Clear card if you are a frequent flyer who hates waiting on airport security lines. We'd then have you come to an enrollment center, such as at the airport, where you'd present two forms of government-issued IDs that we'd run through special scanning machines to make sure they're real. And then, once we know that, and we know you're you, we take your fingerprints and images and the image of your two irises. We'd capture all that stuff. We'd send it off to the Department of Homeland Security, and they would tell us, typically in a few days, yes or no. Yes, you can give this person the Clear card, or no, you can't, and it's mostly yes. I mean, you can count on almost two hands the number of people who've been rejected as a terrorist threat. Not the smartest thing in the world for a terrorist to go hand over his fingerprints and try to sign up for a card. So then you'd get your card, and you show up at the airport at our kiosk, and you'd put the card in, and the kiosk would ask you to present your right thumb or your left index finger, whatever you told us when you enrolled were your two favorite biometrics. And that would be it. And then you'd go through our lanes. Now, you wouldn't just get on the plane. You'd still go through the metal detector. You'd still have your carry-on bags x-rayed, but other parts of the process, such as having to take your shoes off, might be modified. And that's what we've done. Now, that sounds easy. Now that I've explained it to you, it's a pretty clear, simple proposition, but there were lots of obstacles, and someday someone at this grade school or somewhere else will do a really interesting case study of this. And none of these obstacles were obstacles that I was smart enough to understand or predict. If I'd been smart enough to do it, I never would have done what has now become a very successful business. So sometimes it's really the dumb people who succeed because they're not smart enough to understand how hard something is going to be. The obstacles included, for example, that in the world of Washington, people were thinking about an idea like this, but they all thought it would be a government contract, that Boeing or Unisys or Lockheed Martin or someone like that would get a $5 billion contract to put these kiosks in every airport and give everybody who wanted it a card. And of course, $5 billion would become $25 billion by the time they got finished with cost overruns. And sometime in the year 2048, we'd have this system going. So the government contractors were against this idea that I had, that it should be a private sector program. And the people who rule over government contractors, the bureaucrats in Washington who run these agencies, were against it because they like presiding over $10 billion projects and having these government contractors, kowtow to them. Our idea was, let the government basically certify us and any competitors that our technology is good, that our own backgrounds are honest, certify competitors and let them compete to sell this card, mandate that the card would be interoperable so that if we have a competitor, their card must be recognized where we operate an airport and vice versa, and then let everybody compete. And the ways you compete would be on customer service. If it's a government program, when was the last time you tried calling up, a 1-800 number to call an agency in the government? I mean, you just wait forever. We answer our calls within 8 seconds. And we have to because people pay us. And if we don't do it, they'll cancel and they can get a refund. The other way we'd compete would be price. And the third way, and the most interesting, intriguing way we would compete, really interesting, totally new, is on privacy protections. People really are concerned, rightfully so, about giving someone their fingerprints and their iris images, not that there's anything you can really do with an iris image, and their personal information. Now, people really care about that. So we decided early on that we were going to be beneficiaries of that concern. I'm a long-time card-carrying member of the ACLU. One of your speakers, I think 2 weeks from now, Anthony Romero, is a good buddy of mine. We decided we would just compete on that basis. So, for example, we offer an identity theft warranty. We're the only company of any kind on the planet that offers an identity theft warranty to all of our members. We promise you we're not going to lose your information. We promise you we're not going to sell it. We promise you all that stuff. But if we screw up, you can sue us. You can't sue the government for that. You can sue us, and we tell you you can sue us. And we promise by contract that we will reimburse you for all your costs if we do that. We promise that we're not going to track you. We built our system so that we don't know who's using our card at a given airport. That's why it's an annual subscription, $99.95 a year, instead of charging you, the way EasyPass or electronic tolls do. They say, it's $2 when you go over the bridge. Obviously, they have to keep track of that because when you get your bill at the end of the month, you got to prove that someone went over the bridge. We don't keep track. Our system can't keep that information. We promise not to do what I did as a publisher and what every publisher does, and what every credit card company does, which is we promise not to share, sell, give, market, in any way expose your name or your account information to anyone. It's in our contract. So that was part of the competition that we envisioned. It took a long time to get the government to go along with this public regulation private sector model, but we finally convinced them to allow us to launch in Orlando, which was the first airport that was willing to try this. And then the government said, well, you do this pilot project for 6 months in Orlando, and then if it works, you can roll out nationally. Well, it worked really well, and I also didn't know that in government time, 6 months is actually 24 months, but who's counting? And, we had a lot of people on the payroll, it's time. But we finally got to launch around the country last January, and we've succeeded. We're now in 12 airports. We're about to be in 12 airports. We're opening the Denver airport next month. We have 80,000 members. We announced today that we already have signed up in just this brief period of time 1,000 people just at the Little Rock Airport. Now, again, this has happened to me before. I'm working on a story. The idea for Court TV came when I was writing stories in The American Lawyer about how juries decide cases. I did some of the first articles like that way back when. And one thing that always struck me was that jurors always were fascinated by the process, that when they actually sat in the courtroom and watched the trial live, even if it was a boring trial, they thought the system was fascinating and the whole thing was interesting. And I said, gee, why don't I do that on television? So Court TV, the pure original concept of Court TV, was trials live. Here, I'm working on this book, and I got this idea for this business. No one else did it, and we proceeded to do it. Now, again, it's not without all kinds of hurdles, but the basic idea is pretty simple. It's called risk management, which is if I have $1 to spend at a checkpoint, a security checkpoint, and 2 people are coming through the checkpoint, if I know one person has gone through a terrorist screening, threat assessment, and I know that I have the person's biometrics so that I know that the name on his card means that he's him because he has to match his thumb. If I know that about her, and I don't know anything about you, it doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't even necessarily make you a good person. But what it does is it says to me, if I have that $1, maybe I'll spend 40 cents on you, or 40% of my energy on you, and 60% on you, as opposed to 50-50. And that's the basic idea, which is it's discriminatory. But it's discriminatory not because of how you look, but because of real factors that you have volunteered. You have volunteered to be screened. That's good for you because you get a faster process. It's good for us. We have a good business. But it's also good for TSA because what we're doing for TSA is at no cost to the government. We even reimburse TSA for the cost of the screening that they do. At no cost to the government, we're taking a large group of people, frequent flyers, who within 6 months, 20 to 30% of the people moving through the Little Rock Airport on a Monday morning will be CLEAR members. And TSA will know who they are by their biometrics, and they'll know that they've been screened. Now, the big cliche in terrorism, prevention is there's so much hay in the haystack, finding the needle in the haystack. That takes a lot of hay out of that haystack at no cost to the government in a way that the people involved all like and appreciate. So that's what's happened. Now, I happen to think that actually results in fewer intrusions on people's privacy because if you don't have to search, quote unquote, some people as much as others, the people you don't have to search as much are intruded on less. Now, some in the civil liberties community, including my friend Anthony Marrero, but not really, but his staff believes this, so he'll say it, don't agree with that idea. What they think is, the ACLU specifically, and I love the ACLU, but I disagree with them here, they think that democratization of invasions of privacy is better than fewer invasions of privacy. So in other words, if we search everyone equally, that's a good thing. It's sort of like, there were stories a couple of years ago of Al Gore being a selectee and being wanded and searched. And everybody says, isn't this a great country? Even Al Gore is humiliated at the airport just the way I am. This is a wonderful country we live in. And there is something reassuring about the fairness and the equity of that. But in terms of security, it's pretty stupid. I mean, you're spending your money on that security person who's searching Al Gore instead of someone about whom we know nothing at all. Not searching someone because he doesn't look right or he's wearing certain kind of clothing, but if you have a security dollar, why spend half of it on Al Gore? It doesn't make any sense. So that is where we differ with some of the people in the so-called civil liberties community. But I'll just add an unfair aside that, as I point out in my book, until October 17th, 2001, the ACLU's official policy was that they were against metal detectors at airports. They quietly changed it about a month after the attacks. So we've had that hurdle a little bit, but frankly, we haven't had any complaints about our privacy issues. We've really been, the beneficiary of a lot of goodwill. And again, I think what we're doing is fairly creative and a fairly good partnership between the private sector and the public sector. So let me just close with a couple of observations about that. Private sector, public service. I've had actually 3 stages in my life that perhaps illustrate what I believe can be, I hope can be, the right kinds of intersections between government service and journalism and now a for-profit private business. All of them, I think, I hope, have some element of important public service in common. While I was in college, I did traditional public service. I worked as an assistant to the then mayor of the city of New York, working on issues related to crime and criminal justice and doing a little speech writing. And I did that during my first year of law school. When I got out of law school, and in fact, my last 2 years in law school, I worked as a journalist. And I regard that strongly as public service as well, though it's a different kind. With journalism, you're on the outside holding the insiders accountable. Then I started 2 different journalism organizations, the American Lawyer magazine and its related publications, and Court TV. And I believed then and now that those 2 organizations, as run then, were very much doing good public service journalism. They were also very successful businesses. Then, as I explained, following the attacks of 9/11 and the publication of my book, I began this private sector, for-profit, I hope, business. But now it's true, I also teach journalism on a pro bono basis back up at Yale, but I also think this company is doing a certain kind of public service because it's doing what the government, I really believe, can't do itself to deal with a major dilemma of the post-9/11 world, and that's the one I outlined at the beginning of this talk, which is balancing security and the flow of commerce and balancing privacy and security. I think there's a right way to do the work we're doing with the right kinds of privacy policies, the right kinds of customer service policies, and I think there's a wrong way, and I'd like to think we're doing it the right way. And I'd like to think that our work right here at the Little Rock Airport and across the country, now at 10 other airports with many more coming soon, that we're really doing it the right way. Now, I may end up going back to those other 2 avenues of public service, working for the government at some point, or doing what I hope would be high-quality journalism again. But meantime, I would just argue to you that CLEAR, just like the journalism organizations I've worked for, it is, or at least is intended to be, a private, for-profit company that does perform a public service. So I hope my message to those of you who are students at this great school is that public service can sometimes be defined broadly, and that even a private sector enterprise, in a private sector enterprise, you can do well and do good. Thank you for listening to me.